Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
Studying in the best American universities and graduating and post-graduating at Harvard and having an experience with the American firm and then in London with Zaid, you decided to go back to your country, to your city, Mumbai. And now you are in your own studio and office since 11, 12 years, right?
Yeah, I just finished 10 years, yes.
So how come you decided to go back to your country?
So I always wanted to start my own firm. And I knew at some point, India was the right decision to make. At the end of the day, it's home, family is here as well. And also India is still a very young country in terms of where design is concerned. It's quite a nascent industry in that sense. So the opportunities that it presents are quite good. However, when I did move back to India, it wasn't really planned. I enjoyed my time working in London. And I worked in London between my undergraduate and graduate studies. I almost spent close to 10 years in the United States. And after I graduated from Harvard, I thought it would be nice to move back to London. And in fact, I was thinking of going to Foster at that time, and I had an interview lined up. But I just thought maybe I'll go back home, meet the family, move some of my stuff and move out of America, and then go back to London after spending a month there. And that 1 month of coming into India, I started experimenting a little bit with furniture and opportunities started opening up. Someone saw a piece that I made and used it in a shoot for a magazine, which landed up on the cover. And then somebody at a shop asked me to do a collection for them. So everything happened quite organically. And I postponed the interview by a month more, thinking that I would spend 2-3 months in India, just make 2 or 3 pieces and then leave. And so opportunities started opening up, luckily quite well. And that's when I thought that this could be the right time to then, establish myself back in home and, give up on the idea of moving to London at that point. So it happened quite organically, to be honest.
It is interesting that you tell us and to our readers or listeners, we don't maybe have a very clear idea of India today, right? After all, Mumbai is one of the great cities in the world. And India is a very highly developed country in technology, science, and many other things. So it's quite normal that even architecture has become something very actual in India. Can you explain us which is your situation in India vis-a-vis the other 2 cities that you mentioned, New York and London? I mean, is it so remote or it's part of the same global world?
It's definitely not remote. There are different sides of India. Mumbai actually doesn't really define India at all. Mumbai is pretty much like most of the other metropolitan cities and, quite similar, I would say, closer to New York and London than it would be to the rest of India in that sense. But there are always different sides of Mumbai or even India. But when you're looking at it from a design perspective, even with people growing up in the city, in terms of design, it's still very much raw. We do have a great history of design, but that's tracing back over a century. But in terms of contemporary design, contemporary architecture, unfortunately, there's not much of merit. There's not that appreciation for design or also the encouragement of larger institutional projects or government-run design-led projects, which do happen in the West. We also don't have contemporary art museums or even design galleries in the city or the country. There are a few museums which are primarily for history, but not that many in terms of, I would say, for even modern art. So the exposure to design is rather limited, even from times of growing up or not, unless someone's traveling. Since we were talking about cities like London or New York, even as kids, people over the weekend would go to museums. So they are exposed to the arts from a very young age, whether it's, even the museum or even cinema or theater. So there are different aspects of culture in that sense that imbibe within one's DNA almost while growing up. And I think that's something that lacks quite a bit when it's from a design perspective here. But that's changing a lot. I see that already in the last 10 years of me being here. And, of course, I've grown up in the city and I would always visit the city while I was away as well. every year you could see a drastic shift. And a lot of that also happens with people actually returning now to India, whether they have exposure, whether they have studied or worked abroad, and then coming here, kind of getting back what they've learned. So you do see a massive shift, whether it's from the architects and designers or even from a client's perspective. People are much more aware, much more traveled. So the appreciation now for design has increased.
You stayed in India because you had this idea to go back to ancient craftsmanships of India, from the marble to materials and wood and all that. After having been in a place like Harvard, for instance, and therefore in contact with the technologies and the new world, why did you decide to go and recuperate this artisanal Indian historical and classical craftsmanship?
Yeah, it's a massive shift, especially I would say more than Harvard after working with Zaha Hadid, where it's really all about technology and new fabrication tools. So I loved when I was at Harvard as well and at Zaha, I loved the idea of working with, new fabrication tools, technology, and it was super seductive to me at first. And then when I moved back, I realized that there was this almost a design language that was being created globally, which almost started looking quite similar because of the tools that aided that kind of computational design. And that was just me personally thinking that, it almost lost a sense of authorship. And when I'm talking about authorship, it's much more in terms of like a place and then also in terms of like the hand. So like when things get made with machines, you can't really geographically pin them down to a particular place of making, or even in terms of like who's made it with the identity of a craftsman. And that bothered me a little bit. And then spending some time in India. So when I moved back, I wasn't terribly busy because there were just one or two things that had opened up. And, I started looking at furniture because that was just an interest, but also it kept me occupied in terms of formalizing some of the ideas that I had. And when I started working with that, I started working with something super low tech, just because it didn't require much more of an infrastructure or like a big setup. It was economical to work with. And in the beginning, I always shied away from craft. I found craft purely ornamental. I found it decorational. And I think it was my naive understanding of craft that kind of kept me away from it. And then because of the low-key setup I started working with, the more I kind of understood the processes that were involved with the craft, that's when it got way more interesting for me. I started understanding the potentials of what that craft could do. And what we started doing and what we continue to do in the last 10 years is to really look at a variety of craft, whether it's embroidery, whether it's wood carving or wood, joinery or marble or inlay, marble carving, is really to tap on the potentials of that craft. They're working with generations of know-how, which is typically passed on verbally from generation to generation because there are no actual schools to train them for these crafts. And that's when I thought that it's really interesting to add a layer of sophistication in terms of like a design piece where, you can use that know-how. So what I'm trying to do while working with craft is to really see how we can tap into their potential, but really create something which would even work within a contemporary design language or an aesthetic.
Okay, you work in India, of course, but it looks like if you had very sophisticated clients, for instance, in France, if I'm not wrong, you work with Hermès or you work with Christian Louboutin and other fashion companies who have boutiques and shops and things like this. Am I right?
Right. Yes. And in fact, the very first person who commissioned me to do my furniture piece was French. Somehow, most of my clients have been French, the initial ones. The first shop where it went to were 3 French ladies as well who identified the piece and asked me to do that collection. So yes, and I think also the French have that kind of appreciation for the handmade, for beautifully crafted objects. I think also the thing is that because of me being trained overseas and having a Western education, I think my design sensibility still lends itself to a little bit more Westernized aesthetic as compared to an Indian one. And I think what the craft enables me to do is to just add an additional layer onto the work. When I graduated from Cornell, I worked with this firm called OMA with Rem Koolhaas. That was the time when the firm, after a couple of months of me joining, decided to separate with one of the partners, and then they named themselves Rex. But the OMA project that I was working on was a Wiley Theater in Dallas, Texas.
Do you have any contacts with English, French, Italian designers who are either of the past, who are very successful? Cities like Milano, Paris, or London have a lot to do with design, right? Do you keep contacts with them? Do you work with them?
So my clients are primarily India. We have done projects overseas. We've worked in the UAE, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha for retail stores. We've worked with Louboutin in Bangkok. We've done their store there. We had started a project in Japan, which died midway, which was a ski lodge. We've recently finished a project in London, which was a private home for a Bollywood actor. So there have been a number of instances that we've worked outside the country. But I would say primarily all my clients are India-based. And I think I'm happy to work with India because I think Indian market itself is huge. It's an untapped place in that sense. There's so much work to do within the country itself than trying to seek work outside. We are looking at retailing our furniture internationally. That's something that is going to be done very soon in the first half of next year. This year, we have been represented by a new gallery in Brussels, which represents us for our embroidered chairs. So yes, there have been instances of collaborating with international galleries or collectors as well for some furniture pieces.
Can you describe these furniture pieces a little bit?
Sure. So quite often when I look at furniture, I always look at it in terms of a particular craft or a technique. So the way I even work is that I would investigate that craft, learn the techniques, learn the breaking point of whether it's the material that they are working with or what would be the challenges of that craft and what are the ways in which we can push that to the extreme or give it a new life. So one of the first few things that I had started working with is when I had returned was the idea of doing embroidery on wood, which now has been one of our signature pieces. What was done, what seems to be a fairly simple idea, but it was really the idea of having embroidery or like the upholstery become an integral part of a furniture piece, where you don't have just like a structure and then you have upholstery done on top. In this case, you have the idea of upholstery being an integral part and woven through the structure of the piece. So conceptually, that was the idea. And we worked with this unit where we devised a technique of having almost a gridded form onto the wood, which are about 3 mm holes at 4 mm spacing. So they are quite close to one another. Each of the holes are all hand drilled into the wood, being sometimes almost 2-3 inches thick. And then using Zardozi hand embroidery woven through the thickness of the wood with different techniques, different kind of stitch types.
For your furniture, you have masters. I mean, you look at Indian furniture, which one could have seen in Maharajas' palaces and things like this? Or are you looking at furniture designers like Prouvé or Perriand or Italians like Gio Ponti or Le Corbusier and so on and so forth?
Definitely more in terms of the Western ones. Prouvé, Perriand have always been a great source of inspiration in terms of form, in terms of language. What I look at in terms of Indian inspiration is really how they've worked with the craft. Not in terms of like a formal language, but in terms of techniques, in terms of intricacy, in terms of quality, precision. So it's really marrying those two things together. So when you see the chairs as well that we've done, it looks at traditional joinery. So each of the pieces could be flattened and put together with ease. And they're also working with solid recycled burma teak. And also the chairs are working with wood and cantilevering wood. The chairs in this particular instance have 2 legs, so they feel visually unstable. So again, playing with the idea or the notion of structure and cantilever, pushing the boundaries of a material to a certain breaking point, and then again, layering it with the idea of the craft where the idea of the upholstery is woven through the piece as well. So I think those pieces have been most iconic in that sense, which are now being represented by this gallery in Brussels as well.
Are you considering to have also Chinese clients, being China such a huge market?
None. I did have some classmates of mine who are based in China, who I'm still very much in touch with. But other than that, at the moment, I don't have any clients or seen potential avenues there.
In America, they love ancient Japanese or Chinese objects and furniture, but also they're very inclined to look at what we said before, these Italian and French, Danish or Swedish or sometimes German designers, right?
Absolutely. I mean, in India as well, 90% of homes will all have Italian furniture. I mean, the high-end homes. We also do a lot of architecture and interiors. Furniture is one side of the business that we do. But our primary projects are interiors and architecture. And, in most of the projects that we do as well, we're using a lot of Italian furniture.
What is your concept in interior decoration besides the furniture and what you're designing for your furniture? What kind of style is yours?
So we quite often prefer to do retail projects. I started off with a lot of retail, and retail being because you can always have it quite concept driven. It starts with a strong idea, you're understanding the brand, and you create an outlet which is an extension of that brand. If it's the first store that's coming, you kind of really understand what the DNA of that brand is, and you kind of create a physical manifestation of that idea. And I think that for me becomes interesting because you can work strongly with concepts, ideas, and explore that division. In terms of a visual palette, we're definitely drawn towards a much more contemporary, cleaner lines, but then it's always infused with some kind of special materials that we work with. We love doing bespoke finishes, whether it's for homes or retails, especially for homes as well. 90% of the things are customized, whether it would be wall paneling or wall claddings or soft furnishings. And also being in India, we have the luxury to customize a lot of things. There is access to numerous avenues that one can tap into, whether it's to work with different kind of embroidery units or work with different kind of stone or metal works to create bespoke finishes as well. So I think that's sometimes also the strength of our practice. And then irrespective of the scale at which we are working, whether it's a home, retail, or piece of work, furniture, that people come to us now because of that tailored bespoke service.
What did you do for Christian Louboutin?
That was one of the first few projects that I had worked with. I started as the local architect in their Mumbai store. The design architects was 212 Box based out of New York. And I kind of helped them execute that project here. And through the course of that project, they had seen the embroidered wooden sofa that I had done. And together we had created a wall cladding system, which kind of had that wooden embroidered wall on an entire wall inside the store. And following that project, Christian actually offered me to become the design architect for their Bangkok store. So that's when we created a different look for them. Christian himself loves lots of crafts. He's always, enamored with India. He loves handmade. He loves working with different textures, materials. So it was quite interesting to see how we can almost take certain kind of Thai influences, French influences, but yet all made in India with different crafts, and we had them shipped to Bangkok. So that became quite an interesting project as well. And then we again worked on another extension of the Mumbai store back in India. The extension was again done with 212 Box, we being their local architect. So yeah, it was an exciting journey, and it was also an introduction into luxury retail. Being the local architect, I think really helped me understand how certain luxury stores are dealt with, the details that kind of are necessary to facilitate that kind of a store. So it was one of my biggest learnings, in fact, actually, his project.
The great architect for this kind of thing is Peter Marino, no?
Marino, of course. The way he approaches every single brand creates a completely new language for them. So it doesn't really become as a signature style of an architect, which becomes quite common sometimes. But he really is able to step out of his zone and really make a different environment for every single brand, which I think is fantastic.
What is your idea? What is the concept?
With Hermes, we work on their window displays. We are in our 9th year now. And luckily with Hermes, it's such an inspiring brand. There's so much to learn in the way in which every single product is conceived. But we do not work at all with the retail store or any of their products. It's just purely the windows.
What is your aim? You want to attract the eye, obviously, of the people who look at the windows, right?
What's quite fascinating in the way in which at least Hermes tackles their windows as compared to other international brands is that they really create a narrative or a story that the passerby kind of gets absorbed into that environment and just provokes you to smile. And I think that's something which is quite interesting. It's not so much of a hard sell of a product in front as much as it really invites you into a universe, almost engulfing you into an environment for a few seconds that you're kind of piercing through that window. And I think that itself as a brief becomes very interesting because we create 4 windows a year. We change every 3 months. And every time we need to come up with a new concept. And that allows us to also think quite outside the box. It's quite refreshing to come up with different concepts and ideas which have a quick turnover. And it's fantasy at the end of the day. It's escapism in a way, whether it's for us or even for a viewer looking at the window. We're storytelling. We are creating things which might not be real, might not be practical. They're not bogged down by program or function or practicality. So I think that becomes interesting for me in terms of tackling windows, because it really is another expression of design that we can lend ourselves to.
It's interesting because it doesn't last, right? It's an immaterial job.
Yes, and you can almost make things look like they are floating, they are flying. It's an illusion. We sometimes have things which are moving in the windows, which are motorized. So it really is a fantasy in that sense. It's that kind of an expression, which becomes quite interesting, especially when you're working on an architectural project, which might take 3 years. And then you're working on an interior project, which takes over a year. And then something like this needs to be churned out in less than a month. That shift also as on a daily basis becomes quite interesting for us and keeps our minds always active in terms of coming up with ideating on different things.
There are Indian people, Indian elite all over the world, from Africa to United States to Europe. Your ambition is that these Indians who live abroad will have nostalgia for their own craftsmanship and then become your clients, or you don't think of that?
When it comes to furniture, it's really a passion project. I really create objects or pieces that I really absolutely love, not thinking of an end user or whether it's practical, functional, comfortable, or whether they are going to be sold. And I think that has allowed us to really be the most creative in that sense. So I use furniture just as an outlet for that creativity. And we have luckily managed to get a really good clientele in India, at least for the moment, who appreciates that. More and more people love the idea of having things bespoke, of having things limited edition, or even valuing the craft. There's definitely been a new resurgence of craft, the appreciation for craft, the realization that craft is telling a story. It talks about a legacy, it talks about a history, it talks about lineage. And I think that's being fairly noticed now.
You have to work a lot on social medias or Instagram, to show your products all over the world. And your ambition is one day to create your style and this kind of Indian taste, modern taste, let's say contemporary taste, also in many other countries.
Yeah, I would hope so. I think that's the only way one can even sustain craft. Embroidery has been used by a lot of luxury brands everywhere, most of the French brands. And when you see what they do, and almost every brand creates a very different identity using the same tools of embroidery. No two brands kind of look the same in terms of the style in which they work with. And I think that's something that needs to happen with the rest of the craft in India as well. It needs a much more contemporary voice, because what happens is that even some of the people working with craft, it's quite often the same product being repeated over generations. And it's not just the know-how that's been passed over, but also the aesthetic or the formal language. For me, what becomes important is to make that shift of adding a new voice to that know-how. So to continue the know-how, but not particularly imitate that aesthetic.
What is your next ambition?
We've now, since the last year and a half, luckily gone into building some architecture, pieces of architecture, and I'm quite excited to see them come alive. Architecture, of course, is my number one passion, and I'm looking forward to creating more pieces of architecture throughout the city. I think that's also a great legacy to leave behind. Completely different from talking about the windows that disappear in 3 months. A building stays on, for a while, if not forever. I think it's quite a social responsibility as well when you're creating a piece of architecture.
You are a furniture designer, you are an interior designer, you are a window specialist, but ultimately you are an architect. And this is what you are mostly, right? What would you like to build?
A contemporary arts museum.
So you want to create the first contemporary art museum in India, right?
Regardless if it's first or not, but definitely one for sure.
Okay, so thank you very much. I hope your wishes will become reality.
Alain Elkann interviews.